G'day. So, all experiences are at one stage an appearance on consciousness. So, all meaningful things that ever occurred at one stage were an appearance on consciousness. So tonight I'm going to argue that we're in the precipice of being able to tinker under the hood of consciousness, and that is pretty profound and has some pretty important, I think, ethical obligations and imperatives. First, before I do that, I'm very quickly going to explain sort of some of the important developments in neuroscience and psychology that led to this being a significant thing. So, although anyone who likes to think about the brain is going to scoff at Freud, he really was the father of neuroscience, and he had this great idea of unconscious and conscious processing. These days, it's kind of being a lot nicer said. It's talked about dual process theory, and it's talked about in terms of, and dual process theory is kind of fundamental in explaining cognition, thinking, audition, and visual processing and stuff. So, but Freud would argue that there are, beneath your sort of streamlined conscious experience is a sort of powerful, associative, unconscious experience. In the 1940s, researchers like Skinner and Watson said, oh no, I don't like this idea, you're talking, it's unfalsifiable, and it's not being able to explain interesting things like learning, habits, and behavior. So they put a bunch of rats in boxes, and this idea of behaviorism came out. You could explore sort of brain functions by looking at behaviors. But in the 1960s, a lot of researchers started saying, well, this is great, you've really fixed up a lot of Freudian stuff, but you've not really explained the rich mental life. If you treat the brain like a black box, you're not really able to describe things like, as Noam Chomsky would have argued, language, right? So, fortunately, all of this was settled in the 80s and 90s when brain imaging came around, right? So, in the 80s, things like PET scans were able to look at how chemicals in the brain, such as neurotransmitters, were only engaged in specific functions, and then MRIs in the 90s were great at looking at how specific regions were only doing work in specific, or would only light up during specific tasks. This kind of confirmed the cognitive theories of the 60s and said that the brain was functional, that individual regions were doing specific sorts of work. So what do we think of the brain as now? So contemporary theories of brain function would argue that the brain is a computational organ, right? Specifically, some would say, is a Bayesian inference machine. So, or it is a predictive coding machine. The brain is making the brain is inferring the causes of sensory experience by generating a generative model of the world. So at any one stage, say for example, you're sitting here listening to me, your experience is not just the static endpoint of visual and auditory processing, right? Like you're updating this rich tapestry of experience and integrating it with new things. So you've got a predictive model of the world that's going on and updated. So think of it like this, maybe. If you have, if you agree with me, right, and you're like, oh, cool, then you like solidify that into your memory, and that's like embraced as part of your generative model. But if you don't agree with me, like he's committed an error, bullshit, then you sort of say that's not relevant and it doesn't become part of your generative model. So why this is important, before I say why it's important, I'll say, so what is doing this computation? What's doing the kind of this functional processing? Well, is it the neurons, right? Is it the neurotransmitters that are firing across the neurons? Is it just the synapses themselves, which is the junctions between these different neurons? Or is it something larger like groups of neurons? So although sort of all of them really, but most of the sort of processing that we care about is done not by individual neurons, but by groups of neurons called ensembles, neuronal ensembles. So these neurons will all communicate together, and they will form hierarchies or networks, hierarchical networks, where they will all engage, have specific functions to do specific tasks, and how they are arranged and how they are activated will have an impact on how it's kind of what information processing is going on in the brain at that time. So the way they do this is by using electrical waves, right? So I have one ensemble over here and another ensemble over here, and it's sort of pulsating at a specific frequency. And depending on the relationship between those pulsations would mean different things. So in the same way a computer might use ones and zeros, two ensembles might communicate by either oscillating in phase or out of phase, and that would mean something different from like a computational perspective. So why is this significant? Well, in the same way that antidepressants and psychotherapy are fantastic treatments for depression, but obviously they haven't really touched the science, right? So, and that's really because although the way Freud and the behaviorists thought about the brain, which was great for CBT, the brain isn't really sort of this like weird Freudian organ. In the same way that when we started looking at the brain as a chemical organ in the 80s with PET scans, the brain wasn't really a chemical organ, hence why you can't like completely fix it using using chemicals, right? So this is really cool because if the brain is an electrical or computational organ, then in the early 2000s, well, and even before that, people started coming up with really clever ways of manipulating, tweaking individual nodes, or sorry, individual ensembles or networks. So Walter Paulus and Michael Nietzsche in 2000 came up with this technology, which I'll go through a bit more later, called TDCS. So obviously, as I said, we've been working on non-invasive methods of brain stimulation for many years. It was known from the beginning of the 20th century that you could stimulate a brain, but the problem with that is to cause neurons to fire, you also have to cause all the pain receptors to fire. So it was the most excruciating sensation possible. It was still reserved for electroconvulsive therapy, right? Because if it works, if it's going to stop someone with really severe depression from having that depression, then it's going to be worth it in that case. In the mid-80s, some people worked out some really great ways of using magnets to target specific regions, and that became TMS, transcranial stimulation. But the problem with those is, obviously ECT is heinous, but TMS is expensive, it's big, and it's not particularly targeted. So TDCS, as I showed before with Michael Nietzsche and Walter Paulus, which I'll go through the details of in a second, has become really, really popular since the beginning of the 2000s. So it's now really a staple in neuroscience and psychology. It's a very common technique. So why is this important? Well, so say if someone with depression has underactivation in their frontal lobes, for example, stimulating that area, running a small current through those areas is effective in treating depression. So here is a recent meta-analysis that was done, and it was something in 2013, Fregni and Baroni showed that this sort of TDCS, as it's called, was as effective as SSRIs in treating depression, which is pretty cool because SSRIs take a couple of weeks to have an effect, and they make people obese, they destroy sex drive, and stuff like that. So anything's better than an SSRI. So can you use it to improve cognitive function in a healthy person or improve the mood of a healthy person? So actually, when I wrote this originally, the answer was no, you can't improve the mood, but 2 studies, and there's a couple of meta-analyses that showed that, but since then 2 studies have come out showing that you can sort of improve mood in healthy people. So I shouldn't say that. But interestingly, there is a number of studies, a lot done here in Australia, looking at the effect on working memory and attention. So in a healthy person, you can, by stimulating the front bit of the brain, you can improve their cognition. Can you use it to improve the cognitive function of an older person? Well, yeah, the first paper came out last year showing that for, I think it was 10 minutes a day for 2 weeks would have positive effects on sort of age-related cognitive decline for a few weeks, for a month or 2 afterwards, and there's been several studies that have sort of replicated that. So unsurprisingly, there's heaps of military research going on, and it's great as well because it's not sort of like, it's not exploratory like a lot of this other stuff is. It's just like, we want an effect, let's make it happen. So the military have used it to sort of improve vigilance better than caffeine, as better than caffeine, using it to improve the air traffic controllers and their integration of all this stuff, and famously increasing the rate of learning how to be a sniper. I was talking before about how oscillatory how ensembles of neurons use waves to communicate between different regions, and you can similarly use that, you can induce that same sort of oscillatory activity. So it's called TACS, so instead of a direct current, you've got using an alternating current. So there's really good research for the treatment of schizophrenia. And in fact, I was speaking to Michael Nietzsche, the guy who came up with this originally at a conference last year, and he was telling me that in the same way that, I think he was being condescending, but in the same way that using TACS at a certain frequency was improving lucidity in people with schizophrenia, you can improve lucidity in someone with in REM sleep, in deep sleep, and able to induce lucid dreaming. And it's certainly true, it can. And similarly, more recently, there's been research into improving scores on fluid intelligence tests using transcranial alternating current stimulation. So, before I move on, I'll just say, if we don't really understand how the brain works at all the levels, then how can you say we should be manipulating some sort of function, right? Like if David Chalmers famously came up with this idea of the hard problem of psychology. We have no idea, and potentially it's impossible, some people say, to know how this kind of biological, physical organ can give rise to high-level sort of consciousness, right? It's the hard problem of neuroscience. But I want to argue that recent technology, like EEG technology, has shown that you don't really need to understand something in order to get what you want out of it. So, for example, this device here they got hundreds of people. And then got all of this data, ran it through a machine learning algorithm, and were able to then subsequently get certain data out. So, for example, if this machine is able to detect how you're feeling or certain aspects of emotional function, it's also able to detect thinking left, right, back, forward, and really, there's no actual understanding in neuroscience as how the brain, to that degree of accuracy, is able to do that. So the point I'm getting at is that you don't have to be able to understand a system in order to sort of hack it, right? So I won't go through that. So why is it not a thing? Well, it is. So the first proper consumer device, got a couple of papers published in Brain Stimulation, Nature Neuroscience, Nature Protocols, was a device called Think, which claims to run a current through your face, down into your trigeminal nerve here, and then the other current runs out, and then based off one of two sort of stimulation protocols, it will increase or decrease your autonomic arousal, right? So in the same way that coffee will increase your autonomic arousal, and alcohol would reduce your autonomic arousal. And I mean, it's not great, right? Like it doesn't do that much. I mean, I much prefer coffee or alcohol to it, but think about this. I mean, think about how much time and effort we spend trying to manipulate our arousal at the end of the day or in the morning. Like just as a people in general spend so much money trying to get the top-down control over our physiological responses. Since then, there's a whole bunch of other weird devices that are around. So this device, Halo Neuroscience, just came out, and it's targeted at improving motor performance. Again, none of these are as kind of well regarded as this. They've got a couple of great applications, really made by the top guys in the field. These are a bit less good. Halo Neuroscience is aiming at trying to improve performance, and it's reasonable. The Focus device, which is this one here. It's this one here. And then they've got their $10 equivalent. It's pretty dodgy. It's trying to improve executive function. And this one is just a sort of a ripping off of a technique called transcranial vagus nerve stimulation, which is sort of a similar way of manipulating autonomic arousal. Not exactly, but all really kind of profound in some sort of useful ways, although the effects of these are not nearly as well confirmed as more traditional techniques like TDCS, symmetrical TS. So I think one of the most important things that will occur, and there's been a lot of research being done over in the US, although people are collaborating here, Cologne Lou at the Black Dog Institute is working on this, is prescription use for TDCS. I mean, if it's as good as everyone's thinking in treating depression and schizophrenia and age-related cognitive decline and epilepsy and stuff, then we should have prescription use, and that's currently being looked at, although I suspect it's a long way away. So you go into a chemist and they measure out your head and they give you some electrodes, and the device will only go off at a certain time. It will have a set number of second number of uses and stuff. The other next really important development will be when you're starting to integrate, it's currently being done, integrating EEG with brain stimulation. So EEG, we were talking about before, you detect electrical activity, and it is in many respects the Holy Grail. The first device that came to do this was the Neuroelectrics, the StarSim, which came out which was made by a company called Neuroelectrics. Came out in 2014, and then you might have seen recently the OpenBCI, which is this open source EEG, was the first that now has a TDCS shield for their open EEG. saying that though, there are so many like major technological hurdles, and but that's going to be like it'll be a big deal, and that's more plausible. So, you know, a lot of people like to talk about the ethics, and with my undergrad was both in neuroscience and psychology, but I also did a philosophy degree as well. I think that the ethical issue is the most important in many respects, and for a number of reasons. One, everything we do, as I said before, is sort of for the effects on sort of conscious experience, right? So if I listen to pleasant music because it makes me feel good, I eat greens, I eat healthily because in the future I want to similarly feel good, and I spend time with my friends and family and do selfless things because I want other people to feel good in the same way that I recognise that they do. So, but sort of a main hindrance to that is this idea of the hedonic treadmill. So there was a great study in the 80s done by this guy called Walters that showed that we have this set level of happiness, and if you have if you win the lottery, after 2 weeks you're at the same level of happiness, and if you become paraplegic, after 2 weeks again you're at the same level of happiness. So although we spend so much time and energy sort of trying to manipulate our happiness, which is what we ought to do, really, manipulate our sort of conscious experience, we need a sort of more direct method of doing that. So you might say, okay, well, we should leave it for sort of psychiatric populations and no one else touch it, but not in psychiatric populations. But that's hard to defend for a number of reasons. One, if you look at all psychiatric disorders are on a spectrum of healthy to diseased, and we like to define at a certain point, but usually that point is not very useful. And in addition, you know, if you look at how the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Mental Health Disorders is going over, it's progressing, it's consistently looking at things as a spectrum, where healthy people are on the spectrum. So, for example, we used to have Asperger's syndrome in the last sort of DSM, as it's called, the sort of the Bible for the psychiatrists, and now we have autism spectrum disorder. So it'd be hard to, it would be almost meaningless to say technologies should be given to psychiatric populations and not others, and further, you just say, well, prevention is the best treatment, so why not intervene early? I spoke to Peter Singer about this not long ago, the famous ethicist, and he agreed that most of the arguments about we ought to avoid this technology tend to be based off sort of naturalistic fallacy, the claim that if something's natural, it's good; if it's not natural, it's not good. But it's an interesting area. So I like what the Dalai Lama said, which is, if it was possible to become free of negative emotions by a riskless implementation of the electrode without impairing intelligence and the critical mind, I would be the first patient. But I think I would probably try and get another report in. So I do think it's important that, despite the massive degree of commercialization around this domain, there is a strong argument for development being open source. So, I mean, some of the biggest impacts in the technology being available have come from open source development, and of course any company that has made these sort of technologies are using open source platforms, at least, if not such as programming, right? There's most languages, no one's going to reinvent their own programming. So I think it's really important to consider those. I think there's a strong moral obligation for maximizing the degree of the number of people out and about that is able to utilize these technologies, and the best means of doing that is by keeping them as open as possible. And similarly, since some of the open source versions of these brain tech neurotechnology, such as the OpenDCI that I mentioned earlier, there's been all of these really terrible knockoffs that have emerged online. And whilst they're terrible and they're cheap and nasty, so these are not brain stimulators, sorry, these are sort of EEGs, they're detecting brainwave signals. It's going to reduce the cost of entry and the utilization of these technologies and the useful medical applications. So, yeah, I just want to leave you with the claim that we now have we're on the precipice of having the ability to tinker under the hood of consciousness, and I think we have a very strong moral obligation to do so.
Does anyone have any questions for Peter Simpson-Young? Yes, Jay?
I thought I saw Scott getting a little excited watching that. I was wondering if we're seeing an example of Nathan Waters' comment about innovation, the breaking down silos. Yes. Are you thinking of future virtual reality where you have your emotions manipulated while you're playing computer games like I am?
Yes.
Happy moment, you
It's
feel
inevitable.
happy. Bad guy comes out, you feel fear.
Absolutely. I think it's inevitable.
Yeah, there's a great domain of research in using sort of vestibular stimulation in order to. A friend of mine, QBI up in Brisbane, is doing some work on this in order to, so that you get hit to the side and then it messes with your sense of balance, so you feel like you've been hit to the side.
Wonder if you could comment briefly on psychedelics as a means of stimulating imagination.
Yeah, so I mean psychedelics, so the main way that psychedelics work is by reducing the integration between these two global networks in the brain called the default mode network